Now a Shakespeare scholar by his own right, made it, and what is called sensitivity, right? He was sensitive to Shakespeare. His name also begins with S. Alright, he was talking about whether Shakespeare really existed. And there's a poem on Shakespeare called Shake or something. Alright, and that's a good story. Today he is going to speak on Antony and Cleopatra. Alright, we'll finish by 3:30. So please stay put. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all of you. We'll begin in a minute. I'll just open up a few pages and mark the pages and then we'll begin. All right, so from that mysterious unnamed island that we inhabited yesterday for a little over an hour, we move now to the vaster stretches of two very identifiable regions of the world, Rome, or Europe for that matter, and Africa, Egypt. And we'll talk about Antony and Cleopatra. It's 2:10 by my watch, so we will have an hour and 15 minutes of discussion, or an hour and 10 minutes of discussion, and maybe reserve the last 10 minutes for questions, for a general discussion involving all of us, so that we may end by 3:30. Now, Antony and Cleopatra is Shakespeare's return to Roman history after around 8 years. The Globe Theatre was built in 1599. And 1599 was a very significant year in the life of Shakespeare. There's a book by James Shapiro called A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, 1599. That's the title for the edition of the book sold in the United Kingdom. The order in the title is reversed in the edition sold in the United States, where it's called 1599. That comes first. A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare. It's important primarily because the Globe Theatre, the largest of all the public theatres in England, was built that year. And Shakespeare wrote two very important plays that year. One was Henry V and the other was Julius Caesar. And either of these two plays could have been the first to have been performed at the Globe Theatre. Many of you would know that the Globe Theatre was burnt down when a cannonball ignited the thatched roof of the theatre during a performance of Henry VIII. And then it was rebuilt, and then all the theatres were closed and pulled down later in the 17th century, in the 1640s. And in the 1990s, a person called Sam Wanamaker built a replica of the Globe Theatre a few hundred yards away from the original site of the Globe Theatre. So if you go to London now and visit the Globe Theatre, it is this reconstructed globe which replicates the original globe in almost every way, barring a few. Now, there are several other reasons as well why 1599 should be considered one of the most important years in the life of Shakespeare. It's also the year that seems like a gateway to perhaps the most mature phase of his career, because the next year he started writing Hamlet. He also wrote Twelfth Night, and then he wrote Hamlet and proceeded to write three more great tragedies, as all of you know. Antony Cleopatra was written around 1607, probably, or 1608. So if Julius Caesar was in 1599, it's approximately 8 years after which he is returning to the world of Roman history. But it's also a play that engages with the theme of empire, or the theme of world empire. Here we're not talking of the British Empire as such, as we more or less did for a little while last evening. Here we're talking of world empire. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the play Julius Caesar. In the second half of the play, following the assassination of Caesar and the speeches in the marketplace by Brutus and Mark Antony, Octavius Caesar, who is Julius Caesar's nephew and who is the Caesar in Antony and Cleopatra, he and Mark Antony and Lepidus, they form a triumvirate that is supposed to rule the world. And it is this triumvirate which is referred to towards the beginning of Antony and Cleopatra, when Antony's debauchery is being talked about, his indulgence with Cleopatra. Cleopatra is spoken about in terms of a whore or strumpet or prostitute, and one of the characters remarks very early in the play, "You shall see the triple pillar of the world transformed into a strumpet's fool." So fool here means a person who is dominated, and it's Cleopatra that's dominating and subduing Antony and making Antony a victim, a subject of her whims. Now the play, like The Tempest and like Macbeth and a few other plays by Shakespeare, never had a quarto edition. It was first printed in the 1623 folio, and the date of composition was probably 1607 or 8. If it was 1607, it was late 1607. Samuel Daniel, you've all heard of Samuel Daniel. He wrote a sequence of sonnets called Delilah. And he was one of the sonneteers, one of the better known sonneteers of Elizabethan England. He, in 1594, had written a play called The Tragedy of Cleopatra. He revised it once, soon after he had written it, but he revised it once more, and this second revision was very extensive. And this was done in 1607. And there is much in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra which we also find in the revised version of Daniel's The Tragedy of Cleopatra. So either Shakespeare wrote Antony and Cleopatra a little before Daniel revised his version of the story, The Tragedy of Cleopatra, which was also a play, and in that case Daniel would have borrowed a few things from Shakespeare, or Daniel might have made that second and very extensive revision in 1607, and Shakespeare might have looked at it and treated that revised text as one of his sources, and gone on to write his own play, Antony and Cleopatra. So these are matters of conjecture. Now the main source for Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and also for other Roman tragedies such as Coriolanus and Julius Caesar, is Thomas North's translation, English translation of a book called Lives by the Greek historian Plutarch. And of the many lives that we find in Plutarch's book, one is Life of Antony. And it is to this biography of Antony by Plutarch that Shakespeare turned more than he turned to anything else when he was writing Antony and Cleopatra. And this debt to Plutarch is quite considerable, and the extent of this debt will be clear to you when I read a section from Antony and Cleopatra. This is the famous description of the barge, the boat in which Cleopatra sat, and it's a short speech by Enobarbus, who is one of Antony's friends in the play and who kills himself later. And he is speaking to another of Antony's friends called Agrippa, and he says, I will tell you what Cleopatra looked like. The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes. For her own person it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold, of tissue, or picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. On each side her stood pretty dimpled boys like smiling cupids with divers coloured fans, whose wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks which they did cool, and what they undid did. Now, note how close this passage is to words that Thomas North had used while translating Plutarch, where Plutarch describes Cleopatra's barge. The poop whereof was of gold, the sails of purple, and the oars of silver, which kept stroke in rowing after the sound of the music of flutes, hautboy, citherns, viols, and these are all musical instruments. And now for the person of herself, she was laid under a pavilion of gold, of tissue, apparelled and attired like the goddess Venus, commonly drawn in picture. And hard by her, that is close to her, on either hand of her, pretty fair boys, apparelled as painters do, set forth God Cupid, with little fans in their hands, and so it goes on. Now this is the most well-known of many instances of the intimate relationship between Shakespeare's play and its most important source. Also, it needs to be said that Shakespeare generally, for much of his play, retains the order of events as set down by Plutarch in his Life of Antony. But then the events in Plutarch cover a period of 10 years. It's hard to imagine that from the beginning of Shakespeare's play, the beginning of the first act, till the end of Act 5, we are passing through 10 years. That is not the case. Shakespeare very obviously compresses the action very severely, as he does also in the cases of so many other plays. Macbeth ruled successfully for a fairly long time, and it was only towards the end of his reign that there was a rebellion against him, and Shakespeare compresses the action of his play, Macbeth, into a temporal space of roughly 9 days. The long passage of years was demonstrated by Roman Polanski in his film version of Macbeth in 1971, when the actor John Finch looked fairly young at the start of the film, but towards the end of the film, when he was on the verge of death, he was an old man, he had white hair and a white beard. But I'm not sure if any stage representation of the play has really done that. Though towards the end of the play, Macbeth says that he's an old man. I'm fallen into a yellow leaf, he says, the period of old age, where he certainly is not at the beginning of the play. So here also in Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare compresses a great deal of the action, and the play certainly does not suggest a passage of 10 years, and Shakespeare brings together, very close to one another, events that were actually in history very widely separated, such as, for example, Fulvia's death. Fulvia, who was Antony's first wife, and the revolt of Sextus Pompeius, or Pompey, as he is referred to most of the time in the play. There's a gap of time, a fairly long period between an interval between the two incidents. That Shakespeare makes the two incidents very close together in terms of time. And Shakespeare also omits a number of minor details while making indirect, oblique references to some others which he did not think important or too relevant to the purpose of his own play, such as the Parthian campaigns, for example, which are only briefly referred to in Acts 1 and 3, Act 1, Scene 2, and Act 3, Scene 1, to be precise. And Shakespeare also makes Antony's marriage to Octavia, that is Octavia Caesar's sister, a very brief affair. No more is the marriage solemnized than the two begin to drift apart, and he doesn't mention the children that he had, that is Antony had by Octavia, which is the historical fact, and there's no mention of Antony's children by Octavia, or by anyone else for that matter, in the play. There is a reference to Cleopatra's children towards the end of the play, but no reference to Antony's children. And also, Shakespeare makes Antony and Cleopatra die on the same day, which is theatrically very effective and very poignant when you read the play or when you watch it performed in the theatre. But that again is historically inaccurate because they didn't die on the same day. There are certain characters of whom Plutarch gives us only mild sketches, such as the two female attendants of Cleopatra, Iris and Charmian, but Shakespeare develops those two characters considerably. And Elagabalus, for example, doesn't exist in Plutarch, although the lines that he speaks about the barge are taken over from Plutarch. The character is Shakespeare's invention. Now, Shakespeare, when he goes back to history and writes history plays, does occasionally invent characters which were not there in history. And the most famous example of this, perhaps next in fame only to Elagabalus, is the character of Sir John Falstaff in the English history plays, and particularly in the two parts of King Henry IV. And Antony and Cleopatra is a history play, but It wasn't grouped with Shakespeare's histories in the table of contents in the first folio. And the ground for that, obviously, was that it wasn't a play on English history. Coleridge later offered a definition of the history play, in which he said the history play was a play which represented to the audience their own past. So, by that understanding of a history play, a play on England's past would count as a history play, while the Roman histories, but also history plays, were grouped with the tragedies, and that explains, to a certain extent, the organization of the plays in the table of contents in the first folio. The outcome of these events that we have in Antony and Cleopatra is supposed to be universal peace, as Octavius Caesar prophesies in Act 4, Scene 4. Now, I'll dwell very briefly on this, but this is just to drop a hint so that you can read up more on this. Now, this peace that Caesar speaks about, this peace that he prophesies in Act 4, Scene 6 of the play, probably means more than what Caesar means at that point when he talks about it. It means more than he knows what it means. Now, this was shortly before the play. First, let us understand that the play, the series of incidents that the play offers us, opens sometime around 40 BC. That's when the first act of the play may be located in terms of time. And Cleopatra died in 30 BC, which is why I talked about that range of 10 years. Now, around 40 BC, paganism was drawing to a close, and this was a period that now, when we look back at it, we can see it as the period preceding the birth of Christ. So, this, in Christian terms, from the perspective of the Christian world in which Shakespeare was writing, and from the perspective of the Christian world that his English audiences inhabited at the time that he was writing the play, or when the play was first performed on the Elizabethan stage. This was the period during which Christ was born. This was the period in which the pagan empire, if we may say that, was drawing to a close. So what does peace mean here, the peace that Caesar is looking forward to in the play? If we think of it historically, this is fertile ground for polemics. This is fertile ground for religious contestation. This is fertile ground for a cultural contestation. It's an age, an epoch coming to an end and being replaced by another. And shortly before it is replaced, here is Caesar, one of the three triumvirates, prophesying universal peace or world peace. The pagan empire, mind you, was an empire which Virgil, the Roman poet, described as an empire that would never end. And in the context of that, it becomes doubly significant. Virgil didn't look forward to the birth of Christianity. But in hindsight, what happens in Antony and Cleopatra, and what actually happened in the history that the play dramatizes, can be seen as some sort of divinely ordained preparation for the Christian empire that was to replace paganism, or the pagan empire. And so Octavius Caesar, himself a pagan, unwittingly, unknowingly, in making that statement about universal peace in Act 4, Scene 6, is actually prophesying the birth of Christianity. I would invite you to see that passage and much of the play in the light of the historical moment, the religio historical moment in which the play, the incidents of the play are set. A.C. Bradley, on account of this, called the play, Antony Cleopatra, the picture of a world catastrophe. And by catastrophe, he meant the fall of the pagan empire, its replacement by the Christian empire, although he didn't think really of the Christian empire as something tragic that had befallen world culture or world civilization. No. But for him, it was a very significant moment in world history. In that sense, it is indeed a play that gives us a picture of what Bradley called a world catastrophe. The extinction of the pagan way of life, which is represented in Antony Cleopatra, is, in a way, a disaster for the pagan world. But it's also for the Christian world that Shakespeare inhabited. It's a world that's on the threshold of Christ's birth, and so it's a world that can also be celebrated. There's some sort of parallel of this kind in Richard III, another play by Shakespeare. That's an English history play. It's called The Tragedy of Richard III, and Richard is killed at the end of the play. So the play ends like a tragedy, and Richard is not the conventional tragic hero, because he is out and out a villain, many times more so than Macbeth, but it's fairly structured like a tragedy. But then the person who kills Richard is Henry Richmond, who goes on to become the first Tudor king, Henry VII, who was the grandfather of the reigning queen at the time, Elizabeth I. And so for Shakespeare's immediate audiences, the play would not have been seen as a tragedy, in spite of the title of the play being The Tragedy of Richard III. The play would have had a happy ending, given the cultural and political context of Shakespeare's time. So something of that sort happens here as well. It's a tragedy, but in the larger sense of the religious changes that have come upon the world, it's also a play that stands on the threshold of Christianity. And so, to that extent, it's a historical moment to celebrate for the Christian world. Now, Shakespeare's sense of Antony and Cleopatra, the play, being about power, about world-changing power, power that can change the world and determine the course of events. Antony and Lepidus and Octavius are the three pillars of the world. They're supposed to be masters of the entire world. Now, the entire world was, of course, in the classical age, very limited and much smaller than the world as we know it today. Many of the regions of the world that we talk about today, and not only talk about, that people live in and where political systems flourish, were unknown to the Western world. So the world for the classical age was very limited, and there was very little world beyond Europe and Africa or certain Asian countries. The New World was discovered much later. The world, part of the world in the Western Hemisphere that we were talking about yesterday. Now, Shakespeare's sense of the world transforming character of the story in Antony and Cleopatra is conveyed by repeated and persistent reminders of the universal authority of the characters, particularly Octavius and Mark Antony. Not so much of Lepidus, he's always kept in the background. And that Lepidus, the third figure of this triumvirate, should be kept in the background and not be really given the kind of respect that he would demand as one of the three members of the triumvirate, was already stated in Julius Caesar. when Mark Antony had said to Octavius about Lepidus, he shall but bear responsibility, etc., as the ass bears gold. We put sacks of gold on a donkey's back, but the donkey doesn't get to enjoy the gold. So he shall be part of the triumvirate, but he shall not enjoy the fruits of being part of the triumvirate. And friendship between Antony and Octavius, the two more powerful people here in this triumvirate, is an essential requisite for the triumvirate to sustain itself. And that friendship is threatened repeatedly in the play. And Octavius has to try, and Antony has to try fervently to sustain the friendship, and yet the friendship falls apart at certain times. There are quarrels, and they come together again. And Antony has to marry Octavius' sister, Octavia, to try and form a permanent bond between himself and Octavius Caesar. But even that doesn't prove enough. And towards the end, the rival parties that we find in the play are the forces of Mark Antony and the forces of Octavius Caesar. So the triumvirate collapses, and Lepidus also dies. This friendship between Octavius and Mark Antony, we are reminded and assured, would hold not only the two of them together, but would also hold the world together, because they are the part of the two most important parts of the three pillars of the world. Pompey thinks of murdering them. Later, of course, there's a truce, an agreement between Pompey and the members of the triumvirate, and they feast together and make merry and carouse. But there's a point in the play when Pompey thinks of murdering Antony and Octavius so that he can make himself master of the world, lord of the world. Lord of the world is the line from the play. Octavia, whom Antony marries, says that war between her husband Antony and her brother Octavius would be, and I'm quoting from Act 3, Scene 4, as if the world should cleave, break apart. So if there's a quarrel between Antony and Octavius, the world would cleave. Now, what is this world here? The world is the whole world, true. But the world, and I'll just put a few words about this. The world here is not just the earth. Today, of course, when we talk about the environment, we make another kind of distinction between the world and the planet. The kind of distinction that we are making here is of a different sort. It's between world in the sense of an abstraction. World that involves the air, that involves human life, that involves also, yes, the natural world, certainly, but world more in the sense of an abstraction that we are part of. Whereas earth indicates something more tangible. Now, the Romans were believers in values. I'll come to that, and that's a very important part of the discussion. We'll come to that after around half an hour, maybe before that. And being believers in principles and values, these ancient Romans did not engage much with grosser material pleasures. So, while in the play, Cleopatra and the other Egyptians repeatedly use the metaphor of the earth and talk about the earth, the Romans talk about the world. If you scan the text of the play carefully, you'll find that the word world is used several times for the Romans in the play, whereas the Egyptians use the word earth. And Mark Antony wishes to break away in the early part of the play from that Roman ideology and its engagement with the concept of the world, and tries to engage more with the kind of materialistic culture that the use of the metaphor of the earth stands for. Now note this passage at the beginning of the play. This is the first line, the first passage that Mark Antony speaks. In Act 1, Scene 1, there's a flourish of trumpets, and then the stage direction that says, "Enter Antony, Cleopatra, her ladies, the train, with eunuchs fanning her." There's a eunuch called Mardian, who is one of Cleopatra's attendants. Yes, these are the famous words that are frequently quoted from the play. Antony has so submitted himself to Cleopatra that he doesn't mind Rome melting into the river Tiber. There's a similar image later in the play when Cleopatra, who is struck with grief at the news of Antony's death, although Antony is still alive, wishes that Egypt should melt into Nile. It's a corresponding metaphor that we have later in the play. Antony says, "Let Rome in Tiber melt, and the wide arch of the ranged empire fall." Let the triumvirate fall. He doesn't mind so long as he is with his Cleopatra. Here is my space. And here doesn't necessarily mean only Egypt. It could also mean Cleopatra's body. Here is my space. And there have been stage productions which have emphasized the point by showing Mark Antony at this point embracing Cleopatra almost feverishly, very passionately, and saying, "Here is my space," in a manner that suggests that here is not just Egypt, but Cleopatra's body. Or if you think of it, Cleopatra's body, the materiality of Cleopatra's body could stand also for Egypt and the materiality of Egyptian culture. "Kingdoms are clay, our dungy earth alike feeds man as beast. The nobleness of life is to do thus, and thus." Whenever there's or in most cases when a character says thus, the character is actually demonstrating something to the audience. So thus here would stand for a kiss that he plants on Cleopatra's lips. The nobleness of life is not to follow Roman ideals of honor, but to do thus, and he kisses Cleopatra. That's what I would have made the actor do at this point if I were directing the play. And that has been done by directors. So it's a telling set of lines that Antony speaks. "Here is my space. Kingdoms are clay." Note the images. "Our dungy earth." Egypt is dungy earth, which feeds beast and man alike. So the high Roman ideals are compromised rather severely. And Shakespeare proceeds to divide this world into Rome and Egypt, and most discussions on Antony and Cleopatra revolve around this division of values, Roman and Egyptian. And under this major division, under this umbrella division, Shakespeare or the play, Antony and Cleopatra, sustains a series of antitheses. For example, we have the antithesis of honor and virtue on the one hand, and pleasure, bodily, material, grosser pleasures on the other. And then on the one hand we have the empire, which Antony wouldn't, or the collapse of which Antony would not mind so long as he is with Cleopatra. So that's another antithesis, empire and destruction. Destruction not just of the empire. Empire suggests building and construction of something. You build an empire. So on the one hand we have that, and on the other we have destruction of the empire, of Antony's own self. We have firmness of purpose on the one hand, epitomized by Pompey and Octavius Caesar, and on the other hand we have infirmity of purpose epitomized by Mark Antony and also Cleopatra. We have on the one hand reason and rationality, and on the other hand we have passion and irrationality. On the one hand we have images of people rising in life, even Antony rises in life. And on the other hand we have people falling from grace, falling from an exalted position. Characters are contrasted. We have the obvious contrast between Caesar and Antony, but there's also a subtle contrast between Octavia and Cleopatra. And this contrast is built up through a very interesting conversation that Cleopatra has with a messenger who comes with the report that Antony has married Octavia. Cleopatra is struck by grief, she is furious and wants to know how Octavia looks. Is she tall? No, she's short, says the messenger. Does she have a shrill voice like her, which so charmed Antony? No, the messenger says that her voice is low. And this pleases Cleopatra, and she says that Antony will never fall for Octavia, and the marriage will not last. He'll return to Egypt and to Cleopatra. And then she wants to know how old Octavia is, and the messenger says that she's 30. And then Cleopatra grows silent. Plutarch's account says that Cleopatra was around this time 38. Her age is not mentioned in the play, but the silence that we find in Cleopatra when she hears what Octavia's age is suggests that she doesn't like hearing that Octavia is 30. All right, so that's a problem with choosing the cast. If you go back to Shakespeare's time, boy actors played women. And one of the reasons why Shakespeare turned to writing tragedies and wrote his best tragedies after 1600, beginning with Hamlet and following that with Othello and King Lear and finally Macbeth and then Antony Cleopatra, is some say that Shakespeare's daughter died and so he was not in the right frame of mind to write comedies and so started writing tragedies. I wouldn't say that that's a very good reason for Shakespeare to have written tragedies. He was much, he was too much of a professional writer to really allow his private grief to determine what kind of play he would be writing. But the boy actors who performed the female roles in Shakespeare's company, which was called the Chamberlain's Men in Elizabeth's time, and after 1603 when James became king, it was called the King's Men. These boys grew older, their voices cracked, and they were no longer really capable of playing the roles of young women like Viola or Olivia or Rosalind any longer. And it was difficult for Shakespeare to find new boys, young boys, who would join his company and play female roles, because the Puritans were threatening to close the theatres. There was plenty of opposition to the theatres by a group of people whom history now calls the anti-theatricals. These anti-theatricals were posing a lot of problems for people like Shakespeare, and the recruitment of boys into the company who would play female roles was being frowned upon, because cross-dressing was seen as a sort of violation of God-given identity. It was considered anti-Christian, immoral and vulgar, even obscene. And so Shakespeare in the tragedies will find has fewer roles for women than he has in the comedies. They are mostly dominated by the male characters, and Antony Cleopatra is an exception. But the woman here is a mature woman and could be played by a slightly older boy in his late teens, 1607. So a boy who had played Rosalind in around 1595, 96, or 97 would now be 10 years older. So if he were 12, he would be 22. If he were 8, he would be 18 now. Now, the problem with Cleopatra having a shrill voice is that it would be difficult for a boy actor to play a mature woman with a shrill voice if the boy actor were in his late teens. And so I'm not very sure about what Shakespeare did. We can't say this from a distance of more than 400 years today, but Shakespeare surely might have had a problem organizing the cast and choosing the boy who would play Cleopatra. But that shrill voice that Cleopatra has is no longer a problem in modern day productions, or ever since women started performing Cleopatra. Now, although Shakespeare evokes sympathy and admiration for Antony, one could discover in the play a moral scheme, which is there also in Plutarch, in which, or within the frame of which moral scheme of things, Antony neglects his responsibilities towards Rome and towards the triumvirate out of sensual indulgence and sensual indolence, that is laziness, out of his enslavement to Cleopatra, who seems, mind you, to be an enemy to the heroic virtues that Rome stands for, which Antony also should ideally be standing for. Now, in the early part of the play, when Antony receives news from Rome, Cleopatra plays down the importance of any news that might arrive from Rome and draw Antony back to Rome. Now, the first few lines of the play, as so often in Shakespeare, sets the tone for the play. It's a character called Philo who is speaking to Demetrius, and the scene is Alexandria. It's a room in Cleopatra's palace, so this is in Africa. And Antony is there in Africa, and these two persons are Antony's friends. And Philo says, "Nay, but this dotage, this indulgence with Cleopatra of our general, that is Antony, o'erflows the measure. He's overdoing it. Those his goodly eyes that o'er the files and musters of the war have glowed like plated Mars. He has proved to be a worthy soldier, martial in his valour." Mars, of course, the classical god of war. Now what's gone wrong with Antony? His goodly eyes now bend, now turn the office and devotion of their view upon a tawny front. Tawny is brown colour, brownish. The tawny front is the colour of Cleopatra's skin. Front could mean the face. So Antony's eyes are now fixed on Cleopatra's tawny face. A bit of racism thrown in early in the play. And then there's a flourish as Antony and Cleopatra enter. And Cleopatra says to Antony, "If it be love indeed, tell me how much." And Antony says, "There's beggary in the love that can be reckoned." And Cleopatra says, "I set a boundary so that you may tell me how close to the boundary you are in your love for me. I will set a bourne how far to be beloved." And Antony says, "Then must thou find new earth, new heaven, new earth." So you cannot set limits to love in this earthly world. You have to go beyond it. And then an attendant comes and says, "News, my good lord, from Rome." Antony says, "Grace me, the sum." Be very brief, give me the summary of it. The sum means the summary. Cleopatra initially wants Antony to hear the news in full. "Nay, hear then, Antony." But then we realize that Cleopatra is actually mocking the arrival of this news from Rome. "Fulvia, perchance, is angry. Your wife is perhaps angry that you are here with me and wants you to go back. Or who knows if the scarce bearded Caesar have not sent his powerful mandate to you." The scarce bearded Caesar, he's a young man. The play is also about this generational divide between the young Caesar and whatever youth represents, and the older Antony and Cleopatra and what they represent. I'll come to that. So, the scarce bearded Caesar, who has just begun growing a beard, maybe Caesar has sent for you. So listen to what he has to say, and maybe Caesar wants to say to you, do this or this, take in that kingdom, and enfranchise that, perform it, or else we damn thee. Maybe this is what Caesar has to say to you. And Antony realizes that Cleopatra is making a mockery of any news that would arrive from Rome. How, by love, he laughs and tells her, and they both have a bit of fun at the expense of the attendant who comes with the news. So it would appear then that Cleopatra is an enemy of heroic virtue. But then it's interesting that when Antony dies towards the end of the play, and those moments in sharp contrast to what we have just looked at are very, very poignant. Cleopatra speaks excellent poetry, expressing deep passion and genuine grief. And there's a passage where he describes Mark Antony in heroic terms, celebrating the heroism that she had somehow observed in Antony, the latent heroism that she had observed in Antony, and which has remained largely invisible to the audience and to the readers in terms of actual action or performance in the play. The audience has only heard of Antony's past exploits. Octavius Caesar, in the play, speaks a couple of passages where he exalts the past achievements of Antony as a warrior. But it's significant that Cleopatra, who despises, or apparently despises, heroic virtue at the beginning of the play, mocking the arrival of news from Rome, now constructs Antony as a brave warrior after he dies. This is part of her eulogy to Antony. His legs bestrid the ocean, his reared arm crested the world, his voice was propertied as all the tuned spheres, and that to friends. But when he meant to quail was to overpower. But when he meant to quail and shake the orb, and shake the earth, he was as rattling thunder. For his bounty there was no winter in it. It was very generous. And autumn 'twas that grew the more by reaping. He was not a young man. He was middle-aged, maybe on the wrong side of 50. And autumn 'twas that grew the more by reaping. He became more and more respectable as a person as he grew older. His delights were dolphin-like. They showed his back above the element they lived in. In his livery walked clowns, and so she goes on. The essence of this, and also the essence of some of the other passages close to the one that I just read, carry that sense of constructing Antony in terms of heroic ideals. Now, when Antony goes to Rome once in the play, and that's when there's a truce with Pompey and Octavius, and Antony and Pompey, they celebrate and drink wine and make merry, along with several others. But when he returns to Egypt, he disgusts Octavius. Octavius is disgusted when Antony returns to Egypt and once again engages in the pleasures of the Orient. And we see a progressive surrender to the undeniable charms of Cleopatra. But that is at the high cost of military success. That is at the high cost of the Roman ideals of honor and virtue. Until this goes on, Antony runs away from the battlefield when he finds Cleopatra running away. And the battle is lost. And this sort of progressive surrender to Cleopatra goes on until, on the brink of defeat and capture, Antony invokes verbally those Roman ideals on Egyptian battleground. He invokes those Roman ideals and seeks one final affirmation of his Roman identity, of his, I would venture to say, his Roman masculinity, which he has lost in Cleopatra's company. He seeks one final affirmity of his adherence to what it takes to be a Roman. He seeks a tempered control of passion. And he wishes to die a Roman death. What is a Roman death? Romans conventionally when they fought, they didn't want to be taken captives, and they would kill themselves before they could be taken captives. And Julius Caesar, Brutus tells his servant, "Do you think that Brutus would go bound to Rome? He bears too great a mind." And Brutus kills himself. He asks his servant's traitor to hold the dagger with which Brutus himself had killed Caesar, and Brutus runs upon it and dies. Cassius dies in a similar manner. Cassius, who was also with Brutus, one of the conspirators who had killed Caesar. Antony asks Eros to kill him. Eros stands behind Antony's back and is supposed to stab him from behind. Unlike Strato in Julius Caesar, who had stabbed Brutus from the front, or Lucilius in Julius Caesar, who had stabbed Cassius from the front. As Antony waits for Eros to run up to him and stab him in the back, Eros never turns up. He kills himself. And Antony finds Eros dead, and then all that Antony can do is to take the dagger and kill himself. But it appears to be a half-hearted attempt, because he doesn't die. And then the people come and they take him up and rescue him from that position, but he is mortally wounded. And they take him to Cleopatra. They haul him up to the upper floor where Cleopatra is. On the Shakespearean stage, Cleopatra would have been on the first balcony. Antony is hauled up there, and he dies. But it's a Roman death that he achieves, ironically, in the presence of Cleopatra, because he, like Brutus and the other honorable Romans, kills himself. So most of Shakespeare's Roman characters have this sharp and very well-defined sense of what life is and how life is to be lived and how one must die and what it is to be a Roman. And the words Rome and Roman evoke a range of values, including virtue, honor, integrity, and also public service. In Julius Caesar, when Brutus addresses the Roman crowd in the marketplace and tries to justify the assassination of Caesar, he asks the crowd, "Who is here so rude that would not be a Roman? If any speak, for him have I offended," that is, by murdering Caesar. And they all answer, "None, Brutus, none." And then Brutus says, "Then none have I offended. I have done no more to Caesar than you shall do to Brutus." And before the assassination of Caesar, Brutus and the conspirators meet one night in Brutus's orchard, and they decide to take an oath. They decide to swear an oath that they will not back out from the assassination. And then Brutus tells them that they will not swear an oath. He says that they are Romans. And I'm quoting, "Romans that have spoke the word and will not falter." We have spoken the word, we have taken a decision, and we will not play around with that decision. So we need not swear. It's cowards who swear. People who do not have faith in their ability to stick to their word, it's they who feel the need to swear. And Romans do not feel that need. In Cymbeline, which is also partly a Roman play, partly, has to do with Britain. There's a Roman commander called Lucius. Cymbeline is one of the four last plays of Shakespeare. Lucius is captured and threatened with death. And there he says, this is in Act 5, Scene 6, towards the end of the play. He says, a Roman with a Roman heart can suffer. I can endure pain. I have that courage. I'm a Roman with a Roman heart. So Rome and Roman are concepts in Shakespeare that several of the plays very assiduously construct. And critics over the years have found a number of ways to read the binary division that we have in Antony and Cleopatra between the apparently opposing poles of Rome and Egypt. I say apparently since I have reason to do so. From a neutral perspective, Rome and Egypt wouldn't seem as far apart as Rome would seem to be from the Egyptian perspective and Egypt would seem to be from the Roman perspective. So while Rome is the other so far as Egypt is concerned, Egypt is the other so far as Rome is concerned. But for us today, say in India in 2025, we are not really thinking of either Rome or Egypt as the other so far as we are concerned. So that intensity of othering is weakened now in more neutral readings of the play from a distance of cartographic space and from a distance of time. Now this polarity has been read in terms of Egypt being emotional, Egypt being a place for promiscuity, and if not promiscuity, certainly at the center of love and ripe sensuality, and Rome, on the other hand, being ideologically connected to duty and public service and military valor and to rationality and things of that kind. And in the play, Antony's rejection of public responsibility is a rejection of Roman values in favor of a life of pleasure with Cleopatra. So he cries out at the beginning of the play, let Rome and Tiber melt. And Cleopatra in Act 1, Scene 2, when Antony decides to go back to Rome, says he was disposed to mirth. He was quite happy here and he was making merry. He was disposed to mirth, but on a sudden, that is suddenly, a Roman thought hath struck him. He has gone back to Rome on duty, so a Roman thought has struck him. In 1968, a critic called Philip Edwards wrote a book called Shakespeare and the Confines of Time. And in this book, he says that in Antony and Cleopatra, Egypt and Rome demonstrate contrary valuations. That's the term Philip Edwards uses in his book, Shakespeare and the Confines of Art, 1968. Bernard Shaw wrote prefaces to his plays, as all of you know. He has a book called 3 Plays for Puritans, and in the preface to 3 Plays for Puritans, he has a few observations about Antony and Cleopatra. And he says that in the play, and I'm quoting Shaw, we have, and now I quote, a faithful picture of the soldier broken down by debauchery, and the typical wanton, a playful figure, Cleopatra here, and the typical wanton in whose arms such men perish. Now, this, of course, is something that appears a little sexist and patriarchal, and wouldn't go down well with feminists. But back in the day, people like Shaw and others could afford to write such things and get away with them more easily than people would get away with such ideas today. But of course, it does give us some insight into what people generally have tended to think about the characters in Antony, the 2 major characters in the play. In some ways, the removal of Antony and Cleopatra is talking about the difference in generations. This erasure of Antony and Cleopatra from society, both of them die at the end of the play. And who is responsible for their deaths? Both of them commit suicide. Antony with his weapon, and Cleopatra allows an asp, a kind of snake, to sting her, which is also the mode of death for Shamia, one of her female attendants. Now, contrary to the thoughts of certain people, the asp is not a wasp, it's a snake. In books of natural history, the asp was illustrated, and in those illustrations we have pictures of snakes. And there's a reference also to the biting of the asp. Wasps do not bite, they sting. It's snakes who bite. Although snake bite can also be referred to as stinging. We talk of the stinging of the adder, for example, but it's actually a bite. Now, as I was saying, this erasure of Antony and Cleopatra by the much younger man, Octavius Caesar, is actually the removal, the ousting of a certain richness that is there in the old. But along with that richness, there's also erratic behavior. Along with the richness and the erratic behavior, there is generosity in the old. And all these things, not all of them directly related each to the other, richness and erratic behavior and generosity, these are ousted by the relatively colorless, the relatively unattractive youth. They are ousted by the calculated efficiency of youth, by the rationalism and by the pragmatism of youth. What we have then is a picture of a decline of an earlier generation and a certain set of values. And it is this decline, this picture of a decline, that makes both Antony and Cleopatra in the plays rise to they die, but they also rise in their deaths to a noble quality of being, to a noble plane of being. Now, it's a very complex play. And because it's a complex play, it denies its audiences a single vision. It denies audiences and critics and readers a simple, single judgment. It's difficult, in other words, to say that the Roman values are better than the Oriental values of Egypt, or vice versa. Normally we would think that the Roman values are better, but then the Egyptian values have their own attractiveness. They do not promote evil. So, talking of evil, the play Antony and Cleopatra hardly makes an attempt to explain or to demonstrate, exemplify moral positions. It's not theological, for example, in the way that Macbeth is. Macbeth's act is very decidedly evil, and there's a theological position taken on that. Macbeth forfeits his Christianity, identifies himself with the enemy of God, Satan. He says that he has sold his peace of mind to the common enemy of man to make them kings. To make whom kings? Banquo's descendants. He is unable to pronounce Amen, so that's the theological position that the play takes. Antony and Cleopatra stubbornly refuses to privilege one ideological position over the other. It doesn't take any theological position at all. Philip Edwards, whose book I was referring to, Shakespeare and the Confines of Art, observes that the play offers us two pictures, Rome, Egypt, with equal emphasis. Two equal pictures, he says. Now, and I'll close my discussion with this, maybe just 5-6 minutes more, and then we can have a very short discussion, if you please. In recent decades, since the 1950s, 1955, then onward, post-colonial theory has informed readings. of Antony and Cleopatra. And these readings emphasize the otherness, not so much of Rome, but of Egypt, since most of these post-colonial readings, ironically, have been Eurocentric. John Gillies, for example, in a book called Shakespeare and the Geography of Difference. This was published in 1994, Shakespeare and the Geography of Difference. John Gillies, Gillies, John Gillies. Now, in this book, Gillies argues that the Orientalism of Cleopatra's court, with its luxury, with its decadence of values, with its splendor, with its sensuality and sexuality, with its appetite for material pleasures, with its effeminacy. We have a queen at the helm, two of her attendants are women, another is a eunuch. This seems a deliberate inversion of the traditional, the legendary Roman values of courage, temperance, public service, etc., etc. But again, as I have said, from a distance of time and space, the differences would not be as acute as they would be when seen from either the Roman perspective, or for that matter from a European perspective, and from an African perspective, an Egyptian perspective. Now, the attractiveness of Egypt and the unattractiveness of Rome has also troubled critics. We talk of the high moral values of Rome and the decadent values of Egypt, but there's also the attractiveness of Egypt to contend with vis-a-vis the unattractiveness of Rome. And this has been troubling. This has been slippery ground so far as the polemics of morality and aesthetics are concerned surrounding Greece and Rome. And Shakespeare's representation of Egypt in the final analysis is relatively positive. It's not a negative representation of Egypt. And you could read in Shakespeare's representation of Egypt in Antony and Cleopatra a certain nostalgia for a past, for a generation, the generation that Antony and Cleopatra, the two characters, represent. A nostalgia for a declining way of thinking about the material world. Now, what is this declining theory of the material world? A theory, a way of thinking about the material world, which is declining. Not the material world itself, but the way of thinking about the material world, that is declining. And that's a way of thinking that understands subject, you or I, and the materiality of the earth as deeply interconnected. So it's not a way of thinking about the world which talks only of abstract values, such as honor and virtue and so on. It talks about the deep interconnectedness of the subject and the materiality of the earth, and this interconnectedness is saturated with meaning. It is this position, this theory of materiality that is on the decline. This way of thinking about the material world and human relationship with that material world, that is on the decline. And this is what Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, or his representation of Egypt in Antony and Cleopatra, is probably trying to show. There's another book that I'll talk of. It's a book called Power on Display, The Politics of Shakespeare's Genres. This was in 1986. Power on Display by Leonard Tennenhouse. Leonard, Leonard, Tennenhouse, Temmenhouse. And Tennenhouse says that Antony and Cleopatra shows certain important shifts in political power and in ways of thinking. And he says that the play shows that a whole way of thinking about power is becoming obsolete. What he means is, in that old way of thinking about the relationship between subjects and the materiality of the earth, there was a certain power, and that power is now, that way of constructing power is being rendered obsolete and is being replaced probably by new ways of understanding power. Caesar's way of understanding power. Because although Cleopatra and Antony attain glory in their deaths, it is Caesar who wins the battle in the end. Like Fortinbras in Hamlet, where Hamlet attains glory, but Fortinbras is the winner. And just as Fortinbras prepares to build a new kingdom and honors and orders the honorable burial of Hamlet, so also here Octavius orders the honorable funeral of Antony and Cleopatra. Tenenhaus also calls the play an elegy for the signs and symbols of power. What's interesting is that, and this is my last statement today, that the play was written in the early 17th century when the humanist engagement with material pleasures, that is the sense of Renaissance humanism, was also on the decline. I was talking of counter-humanism yesterday, and one of the ways of countering the premises and the most essential arguments of humanism was to question the ethics of that engagement with material pleasures. Promoted in so many literary works of the period and in humanist writing. Take, for example, Mephistopheles' words to Dr. Faustus. When Faustus wants to know more about heaven, Mephistopheles tells him why Faustus thinks that heaven is such a glorious thing. I tell thee, it is not half so fair as thou, or any man that breathes on earth. And Tamburlaine famously seeks the sweet fruition of an earthly crown. So, what is there in the Egypt in Antony and Cleopatra was there in the European Renaissance for a while, promoted significantly by the discovery of a book in the Renaissance called De Rela Natura, translated into English as The Nature of Things. Stephen Greenblatt, the new historicist, has a book on the discovery of that book. It's called The Swerve, How the Renaissance Began. That's the title of Greenblatt's book. And the discovery of that book, Greenblatt says, was significant because it changed people's way of thinking, from the way they thought during the Middle Ages to the way they began to think now. Now, that of course is contestable because the book alone wouldn't have changed people's way of thinking, but it did understandably play a very important role. Now, the play also, in its representation of Egypt, critiques Western reason, Western values, epitomized primarily by Octavius Caesar's pragmatism. It interrogates the Western prejudice that sees Western values, Western reason, as the universally valid form of approach to life. And so the beliefs and prejudices inherited from Western classical antiquity, such as ancient Rome, and also the technologies that were produced by the new science that was emerging in the late years of the Renaissance in early modern Europe, contributed to the ideologies that justified the colonial domination of places like India and Africa and the Americas by European cultures, because they felt that these ways of thinking were the most, and perhaps the only legitimate and valid ways of thinking. So the question that is inspired by Antony and Cleopatra, the play, but not answered, is how such a belief system, as the one promoted by ancient Rome, or the one promoted by Europe in general, with all its emphasis on rationality and science, works as a mode of colonizing the world and inhabiting the world, and as a mode of empire building. And on the other hand, the richness and extravagance of the Orient, represented by Egypt, connect Egypt to something essentially romantic and poetic and theatrical, instead of rational and pragmatic. And so, on the one hand, we have what is essentially literature, on the other hand, we have what is essentially science. And this play, therefore, in 1607, is a play performed at a very crucial moment in history, because what was to follow in less than 100 years was the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on empirical knowledge. And the play is positioned significantly between the world and the currents of thought that were to come, and one's thoughts that had declined, ways of thinking that had declined. All right, so I rushed a little towards the end, and thank you very much for your patient listening. We have around 5 or 6 minutes probably for a quick round of discussion. Even if you have not read the text, it won't matter. You can simply ask a question or have an observation to make on the basis of what I have said today. I don't know if there are no questions. We can call it a day.
Oh, I see there is one observation, Subhajit. First of all, thank you. You were, mastering so many divergent elements. All right, packed into a 1.5 hour talk. Sometimes I wonder whether Shakespeare was at all happy living in the reign of Elizabeth I. All right, because a woman, all right, ruling England, did it go down well with most of the courtiers or the writers? Or they were doing good service of honor? Because always the woman is put on the dogs for being the seductress, for being the silent, for being the destroyer of the whole world. It is the woman who seduces. What happened to Elizabeth I? The fear of this led her, pushed her, neared her to obscure her color, identity, and everything. Right? We know of the powder-faced appearance of Elizabeth. So, Elizabeth dies, a new king comes to the English throne, all right, whose credentials were again perhaps whether English courtiers at all trusted James I, right? James. Because James's mother was what do you call pro-Catholic, right? Anti-Protestant. Naturally, what about James? Whether he's sharing any of those maternal instincts? I mean, Cleopatra being a woman, Elizabeth being a woman, all right, and James, all right, who knows whether he's also a mother's boy. Was Shakespeare really, aghast with this kind of political environment where women were showing their power on and off? You understand? Then he has a poem called Cleopatra to the Asp, where Cleopatra is addressing that asp and how she's sabotaging this male-dominated power. Donald Trump would have been a victim, perhaps, the first victim, that she says, come, you drink me. Pompey, Antony, Octavius, all of you drink me, because I have drunk the evil in the acid. And then, like a fish, go back to Rome and destroy this male definition of power. That's a thought.
Yes, Sergeant. I read Ted Hughes' poem on Cleopatra. That was a while ago, so I do not remember all the lines. But it does overturn some of the things that some of the conclusions that Antony and Cleopatra inspires. But there is also in Antony and Cleopatra a sense of victory and a sense of the immortality of Antony as well as Cleopatra. So although we spoke of the decline of certain Oriental values, and that decline being suggested through the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra, their immortality is rhetorically foregrounded in the play itself. Cleopatra, for example, says, I have immortal longings in me. So this final revenge on Rome and on whatever Rome stands for, there's an implicit, there's a suggestion of that in Antony and Cleopatra, and one could read the play in that light, and that's precisely what Ted Hughes recognized. He recognized the potential of the play to generate that sort of utterance, that sort of reading. Yes, so far as Elizabeth is concerned, we can't get into Shakespeare's mind, so we can't say what Shakespeare thought of Elizabeth. We very obviously cannot say that. But if you read the plays, you'll find that very often in the plays we have lines which disparage women. For example, there's a passage in Cymbeline where one of the characters says in a passage which begins with, it is the woman's part, that when a child is born and when the child grows up, all the good qualities that he possesses come from the father, and all the bad qualities, the speaker gives a catalogue of those bad qualities, say they come from the mother. So it's the woman's part. The woman's part in giving birth to a child is to inject into the child bad qualities. There are lines in Hamlet that you know of very well. Frailty, thy name is woman. And such lines are scattered through the Shakespearean canon. The problem is that Elizabeth wouldn't really have objected to these lines. What she would have objected to, and what Shakespeare takes care not to show in the plays, is anything that would be seditious politically. There's one play with which Shakespeare went wrong, Richard II, and there's a scene where Richard has to abdicate, and Elizabeth went and told her courtiers the next day, one of her courtiers, I am Richard II, know ye not that? And the abdication scene was censored so long as Elizabeth was alive. Antony and Cleopatra was staged in James I's time. But then there were two other love tragedies that were staged in Elizabeth's time, Romeo and Juliet and Charles and Cressida, but those were plays of a very different kind. Here we have a play about a powerful female ruler. But then the fact that Shakespeare neither endorses whatever Cleopatra represents, nor criticizes in a very visible manner the Egyptian values, he remains very diplomatic in a certain way. That is probably what helps reserve judgment about the Cleopatra that we have in the play. Not the Cleopatra of history, but the Cleopatra we have in the play. Yes, she is sensuous, she drives Antony away from his duties. But there's also in Cleopatra genuine love, there is honesty, there is genuine passion, and there are certain values that are very life-affirming, values which are not easily visible in Caesar or in Pompey and in the other Roman figures. but values which Antony possesses in certain measure. Antony strikes the right kind of balance between Roman values and Oriental passion and genuineness of heart. He is generous. He calls Cleopatra a betrayer. Thou hast betrayed me, he says, and then within a few lines he once again forgives Cleopatra and is enamored of her once again. So that largeness of heart which Antony possesses is quite remarkable and gets in the way of a downright criticism of Antony and gets in the way of branding him evil. We can't call Cleopatra evil or Antony evil, or we can't take theological positions that would be critical of Antony and Cleopatra.
In short, if we along the lines of your argument, see the play as a commentary on the decline of heroic idols. And if we couple this play of 1607 with...
Decline not exactly of heroic ideals, but decline of the ideals represented by Egypt.
Egypt?
Yes.
Not Rome?
Not so much of Rome, because...
If you couple this play of 1607 with the forthcoming tragedies, is Shakespeare somehow foreseeing the decline of the political paradigm of monarchy altogether? And the emergence of new democratic values of which passion is a face.
Could be. I mean, this is a bone of contention for several Shakespearean critics. Most of the important tragedies were written before Antony and Cleopatra, including the English history plays, which were all about kings. But in those history plays, most of which were written in the 16th century, 1590s, with only one, Henry VIII, being written after Antony and Cleopatra. But that again was in collaboration with Fletcher. Now, in most of these plays, Shakespeare repeatedly, and this is a very recurrent motif in Shakespeare, he talks about the anxieties of kingship. And in Henry V, for example, Henry V has a soliloquy on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt. Agincourt is the French battleground. England wins the battle in the end. That's what the play is about. But Henry has a soliloquy on the eve of the battle, where he says that kingly power derives only from the trappings of kingship. The crown on his head, the throne he sits on, take these away, and a king is but a man. Richard II has a similar speech. He talks about how kings have been killed. He calls he's about to be deposed, and he calls some of his old followers and says, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories about the deaths of kings. And he lists a number of ways in which kings have been deposed and killed, and many of such manners of killing of kings have actually been shown in some other plays by Shakespeare. Some sleeping, killed, he says, and that looks forward to Duncan's death. Macbeth was written after Richard II. And he says that the trappings of king, the dress that he wears, are like unusually vulnerable walls of a castle. And one could take a needle and prick that castle wall, and then farewell king, he says. Like a balloon that would explode and reveal its essentially wrinkled, tiny shape, so also the king would wither. So the anxieties of kingship, Henry IV, in Henry IV Part 2, says that an ordinary servant boy can sleep more peacefully on a rough bed than the king can sleep on the kingly couch. So yes, these anxieties about monarchy, these interrogations about the power of monarchy were there. Julius Caesar, of course, is about turning Rome into a republic by assassinating Caesar, who would have been the emperor. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's disperse towards the department, all right? Including a guest I find, all right, you can also join us. We have, what shall I say? Not exactly trivial, but of good quality. High tea, or less? Less tea, waiting for you. All right, please.
Thank you for being in the audience.
We wish Subhajit coming here one and all.
Angela, for having invited me to this department. It's always a pleasure to come back to a place where you have studied, and you'll realize years from now how nice that feels.
Subhajit is James Bond of Shakespeare studies today. Right? Don't undermine him. Let's touch it. You see his clarity, his scholarship, all right? He has kept us in awe for 2 days, 2 consecutive days. There is no mistake, right?
No, I believe it's Shakespeare who keeps us more regularly in awe. I'm only trying to explain some of the things that Shakespeare wrote. So it's Shakespeare essentially who keeps us in awe.
Even today, when English literary studies is in decline.